Hi, you guys. Um, so, microevolution. Today we talked about macroevolution in class, which are the pieces of evidence that support the concept of evolution. And now that we are convinced that evolution does exist, we're going to shift our attention towards the mechanisms that drive evolution. Now, today we talked about two ways of thinking about evolution. One was thinking about it as a way to explain lineage of descent or common ancestry, and the other was to help us explain the diversity of life that we see today. But I'm going to add a third thing for us to think about in terms of our concept of evolution, and that is that evolution, the concept of evolution here, is the change in the allele frequency, in a population over time. So I'm going to go ahead and write this down, and then you should pause it and make sure you get that written down too. Now, this is a concept that's not entirely new. I think I mentioned it a couple of screencasts back. But it is important that we dive into this with a little bit more detail to understand what's going on. Clearly, if we have an allele, we all know what alleles mean. And really what we're talking about is the frequency of going from non-existence, so zero of that particular allele, to having one of that allele in an entire population of species or organisms, population, to all of a sudden, if it's a good thing, if it's beneficial, to having many of those alleles in the population. Okay? Now, it doesn't make a difference if it's a dominant allele or a recessive allele, frankly. It's only if it's going to be something that's beneficial, then it'll actually start to become more prominent in the population. And clearly, an allele, don't forget, is a molecular form of a gene. And the gene, if we go back to this concept of our central dogma, our genes code for proteins, and ultimately those proteins are what are responsible for the way we look, our traits, as well as the things that we do, behaviors. It's important that you understand when I talk about behaviors, I don't mean sort of if you're a badly behaved person. Behaviors could be as simple as being able to use a tool to dig out insects from inside of a tree, the hollow of a tree, or being able to jump from one tree to another, or being able to swallow something. Those are all behaviors, so they're all sort of, think of them as more like activities and functions of the organism rather than a personality trait. Okay? So understand that if we have an allele that ultimately leads to a new allele that leads to the production of a different protein, that leads to the release of a different trait or behavior, and that's a beneficial one, a beneficial trait or behavior, clearly you could imagine that's going to turn into the situation where everyone wants that, so they will mate with somebody who actually has that particular allele, and then slowly but surely you start to have many of those alleles in the population after several generations. All right? So beneficial alleles are an important thing to be considering here. And an accumulation of those beneficial alleles is ultimately going to lead to speciation. All right? So evolution, taken to its furthest extent, will lead to speciation. All right. Let's talk about these things that exist, these microevolutionary forces that exist under the surface that lead to evolution. The first of them is the concept that you've talked about many times and we've discussed many times, concept of mutation. Second one, concept called gene flow. And these two things we're going to discuss in this screencast. The next one is, let's see, I guess I'll do natural selection first, something that we've already spoken about, but not in enough detail, so we'll be talking about that now. And then lastly, we have something called genetic drift. These are all things that ultimately lead to the evolution that I'm talking about here, which is this definition of evolution, a change in the allele frequency of a population over time. Okay, so each one of these things in turn, mutations, gene flow, natural selection, and genetic drift, are forces that will lead to this type of evolution. Okay, so let's roll with this. Let's talk about, oh, actually, there's another concept I need to make sure I cover with you guys before I go too far, and that is something called the gene pool. Now, the gene pool is not a place that you can dive into in the summer when it's really hot out. It's the same kind of pool. When I'm talking about a pool, I'm talking about pooling of your materials. So let's say that you're all starving and or you're all hungry and you're on a hike. Well, everybody has little bits and pieces of candy and snacks in their backpacks, and so you pool all your food together so that you can then make sure that everyone has a little bit of something and you don't all starve to death. Right? So that's pooling of your resources. That's the pool that I'm talking about. So it's a theoretical pool in this case. And let me show you a fun graphic associated with this because it's very apropos of Choate Rosemary Hall. Let's see, where is it? Boom, here we go. Look at this. Look at this hilarious thing. It shows a whole bunch of wild boars contributing to the gene pool. And of course, it's naughty that they're using an actual pool of water here because it's going to make you guys think that it's something you can actually jump into, which is exactly what I said it is not. So the gene pool is the collection of genes associated with a population to which organisms in that population have access. Now, you never have complete access to all the genes in the gene pool. A population has a gene pool, but any individual will only have a subset of that gene pool, and that subset comes from their mom and their dad. So we each have a very limited gene pool as individuals, but the population as a whole has an enormous number of different genes that exist out there. And if you could imagine you had completely free ability to mate with whoever you wanted to, then in some sense you would have access to a significant chunk of the gene pool. All right, so this gene pool is important because when we talk about change in the allele frequency in a population over time, that's exactly what we're referring to. Change in the allele frequency of alleles in this gene pool that we're referring to. Okay, so the gene pool aspect of this is vital for your understanding. All right, let's scooch over to here. And let's begin our discussion with the idea of mutation. Mutation is the most important of the forces that exist that would drive evolution because mutation is the source of new alleles. The source of brand new alleles to the universe, in a sense. And let's see if I think I have a fun graphic here. Yeah, look at this. This is kind of cool. This is showing a replicated chromosome suddenly developing a mutation right there. And that mutation, so the allele used to exist in one particular molecular state, and all of a sudden, through whatever, there are many different things that could cause a mutation, you have a change in the A's, T's, and G's, so that there's all of a sudden a different molecular form of that gene, which could potentially lead to the production of a different protein. Now, most mutations are harmful. Most mutations that happen, or neutral, are things that you'd want to avoid. But every now and then, and we're talking about millions of years now, every now and then you could have a mutation that is beneficial. And if over time if you have a lot of time at your disposal, then you could imagine you could experiment quite often and have a lot of different mutations, some of which would be total failures, others which would be successful. And clearly the successful mutations are the ones that stick around in the population. Let me show you yet another thing, just so you can be sure you lock into this concept of mutations happening at the genetic level. So you can see here that this right here, right, this DNA molecule right here should have G in it, and so it made an exact copy of itself. It's a little weird because it's only showing one strand of what's going on here. However, you could imagine a situation where for some reason, instead of inserting a G in this place, you insert an A, and then again here, instead of inserting a T over here, you get a G. And this could then lead to the formation of a different combination of amino acids, which is a different protein, slightly different protein, and that slightly protein might be something that's either harmful, neutral, or beneficial. Okay, so understand that a mutation is what ultimately takes us from, going back over to here, it takes us from the concept of having none of that allele to suddenly having a single copy of that particular allele. Right? So, and in fact, right there, that single event is an evolutionary event, strangely enough, because, like I said, it's the change in the allele frequency of a population over time, and I just went from an allele frequency of 0 to an allele frequency of 1 in that particular population. All right, so mutation as our source of all alleles. All right, let's take a look at the next thing, which is the concept of gene flow. Gene flow. So imagine that there is a set of two different populations. We have a population of organisms over here, and then we have a different population of organisms over here. And between the two of them is some sort of geographical barrier. In this case, it might be a mountain. It could be an ocean. It could be a stream. It could be the bench of a lab. The bench of a lab bench or something like that. So you can't reach, and there's a bacterium that's forming on the lab bench, and then all of a sudden it can't reach. It reaches the end of the lab bench, and it can't go any further. And so there's the barrier. And there's another bacterium on another lab bench further away that can't get over to the other side as well. But whatever it is, we have some sort of barrier that prevents these two populations from intermingling. But keep in mind that imagine that these are two populations that are the same species. So we have species A over here and species A over here. So the exact same species, but they are different populations because they are separated. All right, so I'm going to call this population 1, and I'm going to call this one population 2 of that same species. So over here in population 1, suddenly we have a mutation, and we have a new allele, and we're going to call this allele, I don't know, Z, allele Z. And that doesn't exist over in population 2. But allele Z happens to be a really great allele. So it turns out that allele Z starts to become something that's pretty prevalent in this population over millennia, hundreds of thousands of years. So that all these things, all these species A over here, have this special allele. All right? And let's just say it's something like having red feathers on your tail. All right? It's unlikely that's going to be a single allele that would do that, so I'm sort of stretching it here, as you know, that we can oversimplify Mendelian genetics too much and too often, but follow me with this logic here so that it can make some sense. So when we're talking about gene flow, we're talking about the movement of alleles from one population to another. So it's really as simple as this. Imagine there's some incredible weather event, some major hurricane, and these are birds. And normally the birds can't get through these mountains because they're too tall and it would take too much time and they would die if they tried to cross the mountain. But hey, can somebody pick up that phone? Oh, good. Thank you, Lumpy. And I'm doing a screencast, so can you tell Mommy? Good. Tell Mommy I'm doing a screencast, so I can't get off. Daddy's doing screencast. Okay, so we imagine that there'd be a major hurricane that would pick up this individual and it would cruise it over the mountaintop, woo, and it would deposit it right there into population 2. So suddenly, population 2, which didn't have that allele before, suddenly goes from that situation that I had before. Yes, go ahead, Lumpy. Goes from a population of having none of that allele to having one of that allele. But did it crop up through mutation? Absolutely not. It did not crop up through mutation. It cropped up through gene flow. And of course, you could then imagine that after millions of years, that if this is beneficial over here in this environment, that Z would start to be prevalent here. Gene flow could go either direction. It could be that population 2 has the mutation of the allele that cruises over the mountaintop and goes to population 1. And it could be multiple alleles that go over in one event, whatever that might be. All right, so those are the two things. We have the concept of gene flow as a way of moving alleles, new alleles, or old alleles into a different new population, and mutation, which is the formation of entirely new alleles into the entire species that exist on Earth. Good. That was 15 minutes of happiness. Goodbye.